authors. booktv.org.
Next, from the 11th Annual National Book Festival on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., Maya Jasanoff presents her book, Liberty's Exiles.
Well, thank you all so much for coming today. When I had the pleasure to be invited for this and saw the program, of course, I immediately started looking at the program to see who else was speaking at the same time as me. And I discovered that there are no fewer than 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, a major Hollywood actress. And so, I know my topic is losers, but, however, I take some pleasure, however, in speaking to you between 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, so you should certainly stay on for more in this tent. But most of all, thank you to the Library of Congress and to the organizers of this wonderful festival. I mean, how great is it to walk along here and see all this? Thomas Brown would always remember the day that the American Revolution changed his life. It was the summer of 1775, the 25-year-old's first on his own American land. He had arrived in the colonies a year earlier from the blustery English port of Whitby with 74 indentured servants in tow to start a plantation in the Georgia backcountry near Augusta. The newcomers must have marveled on reaching this strange subtropical landscape where giant black oaks stood like 60-foot columns holding up the sky. Within 9 months, Brown and his laborers had cut much of the forest into farms. He supervised a burgeoning 5,600-acre estate from a fine new great house, his tenants surrounding them, and 36 farmhouses of their own. Horses filled his stables, cattle and hogs got fat off his grass and feed. But another force was set to transform Thomas Brown's new world. He saw it coming one August day in the form of 130 armed men walking straight toward his house. Now, Brown knew before coming to America of the troubles that had been tearing up Anglo-American relations for at least a decade. A series of taxes imposed by Britain had triggered a heated series of conflicts over the limits of parliamentary authority and the rights of colonial British subjects. Brown confidently reckoned that Georgia, 1,000 miles away from New England, the center of unrest, had, quote, no connection or concern in such affairs. Even in 1774, investing his personal fortune and his future in the American colonies looked like a good bet. But in April 1775, British and American troops exchanged the first shots of the revolution outside Boston, and no part of the colonies remained unconcerned for long. In Savannah and Charleston, the nearest major cities to Brown's estate, patriots formed associations to organize support for the rebellion and approached Brown and his neighbors to join. Did he have anything to gain from joining this rebellion? Not really. The fact that he had recently arrived, and I should add, in 1775, 10% of the people living here in America had only just arrived from Britain. This mattered less to his calculations than that he intended to spend the rest of his life here. Whatever he may have thought of the principles at stake, self-interest alone pointed out Brown's choice. He refused patriot overtures and signed on to a Loyalist counter-association instead. The next thing Brown knew, patriot invitations became demands, delivered by gangs like the one at his door. Standing on the porch, the sticky heat clinging to him like a second shirt, Brown tried to put the men off calmly. He had no wish to fight his own neighbors, he said, but he, quote, could never enter into an engagement to take up arms against the country which gave him being. The conversation quickly turned to confrontation. Some of the patriots, quote, threatened that unless he would subscribe to the association, they would drag him by force to Augusta. Brown backed into the house to seize his weapons, determined to defend himself as long as he was able against any violence. It would be at the peril of that man who should attempt it, he screamed, brandishing his pistols. 6 men lunged at him, blades flashed, a gun fired, a rifle butt swung up over his head, and then blackness. What came next, he would reconstruct later. from flashes of recollection in a semi-conscious haze. Shattered head throbbing, body bleeding, he rattles over a track. They reach Augusta. He is tossed to the ground, his arms lashed around the trunk of a tree. He sees his bare legs splayed out in front of him, funny-looking, foreign things, and he sees hot brown pitch poured over them, scalding, clinging to his skin. Under his feet, the men pile up kindling and set it alight. The flame catches the tar, sears his flesh. His feet are on fire, 2 of his toes charred into stubs. The attackers seize his broken head by the hair and pull it out in clumps. Knives take care of the rest, cutting off strips of scalp, making the blood run down over his ears, his face, his neck. Half scalped, skull fractured, lamed, slashed, and battered. Brown, remarkably, survives. Later, a doctor comes to the place where he is confined and bandages him up, setting his broken bones on course to heal. A sympathetic guard, moved by the spectacle of this badly damaged man, agrees to let Brown get away. He slips out of custody and rides over the border into South Carolina to take shelter with a Loyalist friend. Now, this may not sound like the American Revolution that you learned about in school. But today, I open with the story of Thomas Brown, one of the early episodes in my book, because I want to ask you to throw out that revolution that you learned about in school. Just sort of leave it aside, put it away out of your minds. And I want you to follow me instead through a looking glass to see the American Revolution from the other side. This is a side on which sticking to your beliefs, sticking to your loyal beliefs, loyalty, a quality that we value, mattered more than violently throwing them out on what seemed like a whim, where the losers, whom history has forgotten, actually become the central actors in the story, and where the story of America, the history of America, can unfold in the world beyond our shores. So the story I want to tell you today is about the American Loyalists who left the United States to find new futures in the British Empire. Now, when talking about Loyalists, the first thing that we need to realize is that a man like Thomas Brown was far from alone. Fully 1 in 3 members of the American population at the beginning of the Revolution remained loyal to Britain. It was the default choice. About a third of colonists, meanwhile, didn't have much of an opinion. So at the beginning of the Revolution, patriots were in a minority. Theirs was the strange choice, the one that is difficult to understand. So we're talking about a large percentage of the American population. And what this meant is that the American Revolution was really our first civil war. This was a war that was divided communities. It divided friends. It divided families. Most famously, it divided our founding father, Benjamin Franklin, from his only son, William Franklin, who remained a Loyalist. So this was a conflict that cut right through the center of American life, and it was routinely described as a civil war at the time. Who were these Loyalists? Well, stereotypes still loom large when thinking about Loyalists. We tend to think of them as being white, elite, men with strong ties to Britain, members typically of the Anglican Church. We think of them under the label Tory, which is a term meaning conservative in British political culture. Again, throw these stereotypes out along with your old images of the American Revolution. This was not the only profile of Loyalists. Loyalism ranged right across the social, the ethnic, the geographic, the religious spectrum of early America. It included shoemakers and carpenters and bakers, cosmopolitan city dwellers, farmers on the frontier like Thomas Brown. And most of all, these Loyalists were not even Tory in the sense of being conservative. In fact, many of them resisted the idea of paying taxes to Britain, and many of them wanted to see reform in the imperial relationship. Crucially, not all Loyalists were white. another one of the stereotypes that we need to throw away. Loyalists included a number of Native American nations who saw better futures for themselves, better prospects for themselves under the government of the British Empire than they did at the hands of the white settlers who for so many decades had been trying to take their land. So the Creeks, the Mohawks, various Indian nations ally themselves with Britain. And loyalism also included a large number of black Americans. Early in the Revolution, the British issued an amazing promise to the black slaves who lived and farmed across the American South. They said, "Come and join us, and we will give you freedom." And some 20,000 black slaves responded to this call, running to the British, earning their freedom, becoming what are called black loyalists. So for them, their patriot owners might talk about liberty, but the British version, freedom, was a liberty that they could really believe in. For most of the people who were caught on the front lines of this Civil War, this wasn't so much a war about ideals. It was a war about ordeals. Ordeals like Thomas Brown's, ordeals where your windows might be smashed, your livestock might be poisoned in your fields, you might have your property confiscated by the state, you might be jailed or harassed in other ways. And this kind of violence impelled tens of thousands of loyalists during the war to move into British-held strongholds for safety. They moved to New York City, which was occupied by the British throughout almost all of the war. They moved into Charleston. They moved to Savannah. They moved into the protection of British forces. But the end of the war and the evacuation of British troops meant that they had to rethink those choices and revisit them. They felt fearful. They felt uncertain. They had no idea what kind of future was going to await them in this post-conflict United States. Were they going to be safe? Were they going to be able to have a life? While they were wrestling with these questions, the British held out an alternative to them. The British said, "Come with us. We'll give you land somewhere else in the British Empire, and you can start out a new life somewhere else." So imagine yourself then as a loyalist at the end of the American Revolution in New York City, the last place to be evacuated by British troops. George Washington is marching in at the helm of the Continental Army. It's a jubilant moment for the patriots. They're celebrating this with fireworks and banquets and all the rest of it. It's a great moment for patriot America. But there are still thousands of loyalists who have to figure out what to do. Imagine yourself on the docks, the patriots coming down. You don't know what's going to happen when they come in, but in front of you are the British ships, the ships that belong to the most powerful navy in the world, offering you a free chance at a life somewhere else. What are you going to do? 60,000 loyalists decided to follow the British, and they brought with them 15,000 slaves. So we have 75,000 people leaving these shores at the time of independence to seek out a new future in the British Empire. This is something like 1 in 35 or 40 members of the American population. So in a tent like this, several of you would be out the door. Please stay for the rest of my talk, but it's proportionately to our population the biggest civilian exodus in American history. What happened to them next? Well, this is where the story really gets juicy and unknown. The answers would unfold across the British Empire, which is to say at this time more or less across the world, because the British Empire is on its way to becoming the leading global power of the 19th century. So you go off into the British Empire, you are a subject of the superpower of the 19th century to come. The Loyalist refugees confronted Britain really with the biggest and the most geographically wide-ranging refugee crisis that Britain had ever faced. And Britain's response to the refugees really provides a good case study in how to be a good loser. Because Britain realized, look, I mean, we've lost the territory in America, the United States is independent, but we have to do something for these subjects. We can still get some kind of moral high ground out of this. And so they used the Loyalists as a way to advance certain kinds of social agendas. They put into place a comprehensive program of refugee relief, a lot like what international aid agencies do for refugees today. They gave them free passage on British ships, getting them out of the danger zones. They gave them land grants in Canada, in the Bahamas, and elsewhere. They gave them just the most basic things these refugees needed. They gave them food supplies for a couple of years. They gave them blankets. They gave them shoes. They gave them farm implements. Some of the most amazing documents I found in my research are these catalogs of items that are crossing the Atlantic to go meet the Loyalists as they arrive in these unsettled areas of the British Empire. You know, their inventories of, you know, stockings and shoes and belts and hammers and hoes, and then things like gimbals and wimble bits and things that I have no idea what they are, but can only assume the refugees appreciated receiving. And so British leaders consistently stood up for the refugees. They put into place even a program of financial compensation to help Loyalists get some money back for what they had lost in America, and they consistently upheld the promise of freedom to the black Loyalists. Over and above repeated American objections, the British stuck to their promise of freedom. Where did the refugees go? Now you might think, oh, they went back to Britain. In fact, fewer than 15% actually went to Britain, and it wasn't even back to Britain because most of them had never been there before. They were Americans, and Britain was as much a foreign country to them then as it would be to us now, if not even more so, since communications technologies have progressed apace. And so they found themselves really strangers in an alien land. In fact, the majority of Loyalists went to other places. More than half went to Canada, to the provinces that are now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and to a lesser extent Ontario and Quebec. Another 10,000 or so headed south. They went to the Bahamas, they went to Jamaica, and they took with them those exported slaves, 15,000 slaves with them as well. But Loyalists ranged around this expanding empire. Some, for example, would be on the first fleet to Australia, settling present-day Sydney, Australia. In fact, a Loyalist was the first person to propose colonizing Australia. There were Loyalists who went to India. In fact, Benedict Arnold had two sons who joined up in the East India Company Army and ended up spending the rest of their lives in India. And in the most surprising migration, in 1791, about 1,200 of the black Loyalists, the freed slaves, crossed the Atlantic to settle a new part of West Africa and found the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone. So within a few years, the map of the Loyalist diaspora looks really a lot like the map of the British Empire as a whole. What was it like to be one of these refugees? Let me tell you a little bit about the experience of being a refugee through the story of the woman who first told me a little bit about this. Her name is Elizabeth Johnston, and I encountered her story right at the beginning of my research, and it convinced me, reading her recollections and reading about her experiences, it really convinced me that there was a story here that needed to be told. Elizabeth Johnston was just a girl when the American Revolution began. She was born in Georgia in 1764, and the war inverted her world when she was just 11 or 12 years old, when, as happened to Thomas Brown, a patriot mob came to her father's plantation and effectively chased him off his plantation, leaving Elizabeth, whose mother had died and who had no siblings, basically an orphan of war. She spent the next several years living in the custody of relatives, family, friends, while her father fought in British forces elsewhere on the continent. And she next saw her father at the age of 15. She's no longer a girl, she's now a young woman, and so it takes them some time to get reacquainted with one another. In particular, her father has to deal with the fact that now, at 15, she's a teenager and she's able to fall in love. And she falls in love with one one of his brother officers, a sort of rakish captain called William Johnston, who served in a Loyalist regiment as well, who's from a prominent family in Savannah. And he was known during the war as a dashing fashionable in occupied New York. He was a gambler, a charmer, a flirt. He had been a medical student before the war, but he didn't seem to be very much interested in that. Anyway, over her father's initial resistance, Elizabeth marries William Johnston in 1779. Now, they don't have much of a honeymoon because against the backdrop, their early years of married life unfolds against the backdrop of Britain's losing campaigns throughout the South. And so Elizabeth ends up following William Johnston through one city after another as the British pull out. They evacuate from Savannah in July of 1782. She has, at this time, a newborn son, and she's also, well, he's not that newborn because she's also 7 months pregnant at the time. She follows William next to Charleston, where again they have to pack up and go. She stays just long enough to give birth to a second child. They again move. She goes on her own with these two very small children, heading off again into the unknown, this time to St. Augustine in Florida. Now, they expect to stay in Florida. Florida at that time remained loyal. It was not part of the Revolution. It was still a British territory. And something like 12,000 Loyalists and slaves ended up actually going to Florida at this time, expecting that this was where they could, you know, pick up, start up plantations again, and move forward. But they arrived there only months before learning that this place, too, is going to be evacuated. It's handed over to Spain in the peace treaty that ends the war. And so, you know, Elizabeth Johnston with her two tiny children, her husband's still off actually doing his military service, trying to make a go of it in the third city she's lived in as many years, is having to face the prospect of moving yet again. And so you can perhaps sympathize with her when she says, the war never occasioned half the distress which this peace has done to the unfortunate Loyalists. And now they really have to figure out what to do. So William has been a medical student before the war, and he decides to pick up his career path. I mean, after all, being a doctor, right? Good choice. Everyone should approve of that. So he decides to go to the best medical school in the English-speaking world, which at that time is in Edinburgh, in Scotland. So he decides to set off with the family to Edinburgh, which they do in 1784. And once again, Elizabeth follows him. He goes first. Now she's got 3 small children born in each place she's lived. She sets up the family's first home in peacetime, all under the same roof, together in Edinburgh, in a charming rose-draped cottage that she's very happy about. But for all that she likes living together as a family for the first time, having this new life, there are sadnesses too. Sadnesses of being a foreigner, for one thing. You know, they don't know anyone there. They're very disconnected. The difficulties of being poor. These are people who were middle class, who have lost everything, a lot of what they had in the war, and they have to set up from scratch. And then also they suffer other calamitous 18th century woes. Her 4th child, who is born in Scotland, dies of thrush not long after, and she's had a child in every place she's lived. She now plants her first gravestone in Scotland's soil. And the question of the future remains hauntingly unresolved. The family gets some compensation for their losses from the British government, but it's not enough to live on, and the career opportunities are not all that they would wish for. And so William Johnston decides to move yet again, this time to the richest place in the world. You'd think it would be a good place to go. And I'll just read you very briefly about the place that they go, which is Jamaica. Its beauty could take your breath away. From the sparkling surface of the water, your gaze swept sharply up to the craggy blue mountains climbing into the clouds. Over the rippled slopes fell a living green blanket, textured in the weird vegetable forms of the tropics, giant ferns and tufted bromeliads, flap-eared plantains, muscular trees draped in epiphytes, careening stands of bamboo and sinewy palms. When you turned past the outer lip of the harbor, you floated over the broken stones of the old capital of Port Royal, mostly destroyed in a 1692 earthquake. The gleaming sand swept around the shoreline to Kingston, Port Royal's replacement, the greatest British metropolis in the Caribbean. Gulls sliced circles around the masts, and the sun cut the water into liquid diamonds. No wonder Loyalists were captivated by it. Such hills, such mountains, and such verdure, everything so bright and gay, it is delightful, gushed one newcomer on cruising toward this spectacular landscape. An 18th century aesthete effusively compared the Bay of Kingston to the Bay of Naples, with the Blue Mountains standing in for Vesuvius and the submerged ruins of Port Royal shimmering like a Pompeii under the sea. Others let the grandeur and sublimity simply overcome them, knocking language from their lips. Whatever else Loyalist refugees knew of this lush island, they could see it wasn't the 13 colonies anymore. Now, the place that it was, Jamaica, was at that time the richest colony in the British Empire. And in fact, if you want to know why Britain manages to bounce back from the American Revolution as successfully as it does, it's partly because it holds on to its most valuable territory, which is in the Caribbean. So it seems like a great place to have a flourishing career. But the very things that make Jamaica so rich and appealing, its incredibly lucrative sugar cultivation and its lush tropical environment that lures many of us there on vacation if we are so lucky today, these very things actually make it also quite a dangerous and difficult place to be. For one thing, all of that sugar is cultivated by a huge slave labor force. The ratio of slaves to whites is about 10 to 1, and the white minority asserts its power through this incredible sort of reign of terror and violence on the island. There are virtually no white women. So Elizabeth Johnston shows up in this place that is very violent, with almost nobody for her to relate to speak to. And the tropical lushness is an issue as well, because it also means disease. Now, William Johnston is a doctor, so this is a useful place for him to be. But very soon, the diseases of the island will turn fatally inward on the family as well. So a toddler called Jane dies of scarlet fever. A baby, then they have a new baby. They name the baby Jane. This is a common practice in the 18th century. And that baby also dies of smallpox. The eldest son dies of yellow fever. The eldest daughter becomes mentally ill. It's a fatal place for the Johnston family. And Elizabeth falls into a deep depression. She says, much exhausted in mind and body, having no female relation to be with me, only black servants. It's too much for her to bear. She decides to go again. If you think that you've heard a lot about the different places she's going, I mean, just imagine what it's like for her to live through all of this. So she decides to leave this dangerous island behind, and this time they go to Nova Scotia, the very idea of which horrifies her. William finds this place. He says, hey, I've booked you a passage to Nova Scotia. And she says, what, to be frozen to death? Why, better send us to Greenland. She's horrified. But in Nova Scotia at last, Elizabeth Johnston, after 25 years on the move, will stay put. Little did I think that I and all my family would ultimately settle in Nova Scotia, she says. But there she stays. It's the #1 Loyalist haven. Her surviving children all end up joining her there and flourishing, enjoying a kind of status and success they could never have had if they had remained in the U.S. And by the time she sets down her memoirs, decades after all of this has happened, she's lived as long in one place as she had lived on the move before. So I told you at the outset, this is the American Revolution through the looking glass, as you haven't seen it before, and we need to turn our assumptions and perspectives around. And so maybe the last assumption that we have to turn around is the one that says that these people were losers. For in a sense, finally finding homes in the greatest world power of the 19th century, finding stability, finding a new life, in a sense, were they not victors after all? Now, I'm very happy to take questions, and while I let you formulate your questions, let me just say one final thing about this story. I have been working on this book for many years, and little did I think that this book would come out at a time when revolutions are again sweeping the world in the Middle East. And I just want to say a quick word about why I think this story matters now, also speaking in the shadow of the Capitol. Now, the revolution, of course, remains a touchstone for our ideas about who we are in America. Who we are as Americans. Now more than ever, this is sort of in the news as a touchstone. But we also live in a moment, of course, of great partisanship, very much in the news as well. And so I think it's worth looking at this story and attending to it, to realize that even at our founding, we were a people of many ideas, of deeply felt values. And, we had great divisions within our society. We had to make one nation out of people who had fought a civil war. And so the lesson here, I think, would be to, hang on to common principles, celebrate them, but there isn't just one kind of freedom. There isn't just one way to pursue happiness. There isn't just one way to be American. And the other point is about the international context, that, this is a good reminder that our history has always been embedded in the history of the wider world. The history of America is part of a world history. And the story of the Loyalist refugees shows how American people and American ideas have made their mark on the wider world, but also perhaps show us how we need to bring things from that wider world back here to America in certain ways. So the strength of our country, it seems to me, is, founded in our wonderful unity, but the beauty of it resides in our diversity. So with that, I see there are people with questions.
Those Loyalists who were religious, particularly those who professed Christianity, what biblical and or other explanations were given to justify their taking a stand by remaining loyal to their original national roots there?
So the question, if you couldn't hear it, is about religion and the American Revolution. So Anglicanism, there was some correlation between Anglicanism and Loyalism. In particular, you find clergymen who have, of course, sworn an oath of sorts, right, to the Church of England, which is the established church, of which the king is the head. So for these people, there is definitely an element to which it is sacrilege, as well as, political disloyalty, to break with the royal authority. Scriptural passages, I'm afraid I can't cite for you, but I could direct you, if you'd like to chat afterward, to some of the very prominent Loyalist clergymen who wrote very passionately on this very theme, providing some biblical support.
Hi, Maya, I have two questions, the second of which you almost killed from your final talk. But the first was, when I first saw you on television, I was just curious. You're going into a subject matter which is totally different from most historians. Were you influenced by your esteemed parents who look at the world a little differently? Maybe you want to tell them who they are. And my second question is, when you do watch the revolutions in the Middle East, you watch the people there, do you sort of empathize with them and sort of say, oh, I know what they're going through?
Yeah, so the first question about how I came to see the American Revolution this way is very much, it's partly a personal story, I suppose. I'm a historian of the British Empire by training, and by origin. I'm half Indian, and my father's from New York, but, I have a somewhat mixed background. And so my first book looked at the British Empire in India and in Egypt. And so it was while working on that I kind of realized, wait, there's this other thing happening in the British Empire that I actually don't know anything about, that I last learned about in AP US history, and that I'm making these huge arguments about how the British world is changing without paying any attention to the place that I actually am from. And so I came back to the American Revolution through that lens. And I then realized, oh wait, if you come at it from that direction, then you just see it very differently. And so I would just say from this, history always looks different depending on where you stand and where you're seeing it from. And I don't think I would have seen it in this way if I had come up through the American history track. In terms of the Middle East revolutions, I would just say that, another lesson we can get from this story is that no revolution fails to leave problems and challenges that the regime that comes up after it has to deal with. And, we can celebrate the wonderful visions of democracy that are being articulated in Tahrir Square and Tunisia and elsewhere, but we also have to realize that that's just the very beginning of a story that may end up taking quite unexpected forms.
Sorry. Your parents are esteemed scholars, and I'm wondering if they said to you, Mari, you got to look at things differently. That didn't affect your outcome? Not at all?
It was in my mother's milk, what can I say?
Yes, could you address the question of those loyalists who either remained behind in the new nation or for whatever reason after a period of time in exile decided to return to the new nation, and how they fared and how they were treated by their fellow Americans? Thank you.
Sure. The question is how loyalists fared who stayed. Now, the majority of loyalists did stay, and they were in various ways reintegrated into American society. I think there are a couple points I would like to stress here. The first one is that at the moment of the British withdrawal in 1783, that outcome was in no way clear. There were lots of episodes of violence, of legal measures taken against former loyalists, and so for a period of a year or two, things were fairly uncertain. That said, there was not, in the end, a bloodbath. We did not have guillotines in America. We had no reign of terror. We didn't have gulags either. So, the story of the loyalists in America has often been woven into, I think, a very good story about the ability of our country to accommodate dissent. And so you do see loyalists being reintegrated. Now, they tend to be reintegrated with the emergence of political parties in America. So former loyalists are overwhelmingly Federalists, and there are a lot of ways in which in the early Republic you can see the kinds of arguments that loyalists espoused before the Revolution taking on new forms in how they deal with the Anglo-American relationship going forward. I think we have time for just a couple quick questions. So
I've got a couple quick ones. First, I recall reading about an article about your book that you found a gravestone in India, so maybe you could talk about that. And secondly, you mentioned loyalist compensation, but I'm also aware that British would not permit claims to be made if a Tory, was forced to take an oath to support the patriot cause, under stress, obviously. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so these are two great questions. The first one is about India. One of the great pleasures for me of doing this book was following the loyalists wherever they went, because I wanted to see what they left behind. What they left behind in terms of documents, of course, which is the lifeblood of historical research, but also the intangible things they left behind, because only a privileged few can leave documents. And one of the most amazing things that I saw was the grave built by a former loyalist who moved to India, became there an incredible sort of military commander with a huge estate, married an Indian woman, had a half Indian family, and spent the rest of his life there in India. His eldest son predeceased him, and so he built this wonderful monument, which is illustrated in the book, reasons to take a look at the book, which is still there, and it rises out of this mustard field in the middle of, central North India, just this amazing testament, I think, to the mingling of cultures. The other question concerns the Loyalist Claims Commission, which is a remarkable commission whereby the British government decides to give compensation using treasury funds to Loyalist claimants. And It sounds great. It is great. Of course, there are bureaucratic and legal hurdles, and so there are various ways in which it's practically very difficult for Loyalists to make claims. They have to prove their loyalty. They have to prove the value of the property that they've lost. And in this process, if there are kind of glitches in the case, like, oh, you did this at one time and you said that at another, it can make it more difficult for them to win compensation. I think one very last question.
Okay, well, actually, it's two. One is what became of Elizabeth Johnston's father, whom we last saw reluctantly giving her in marriage. And the other one is about the way the narrative of the Loyalists has been used for fiction, as far as I know, only by Kenneth Roberts and Oliver Wiswell, whereas the narrative of the South Side in the 1860s Civil War has been pretty well, in many ways at any rate, hijacked by the South. And I'd like you to address the different ways the two have been handled.
Sure. Well, I think they sort of go together. So Elizabeth Johnston's father fights in the army. He goes to Britain for a little while and gets a Loyalist claim. He files a Loyalist claim. He then resettles in Nova Scotia, the #1 place for Loyalist refugees, and he ends up living the rest of his life there, dying there, and is buried in Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia. The reason this fits in with the second question, which is a fascinating question about essentially memory of these conflicts, is that, you know, my suggestion that the Loyalists are victors in the end is in a sense brought out by the fact that we don't have this kind of lost cause literature. We don't have them sort of raising secret toasts like the Jacobites, you know, to the restoration of the monarchy in America. And we don't have this kind of lore, folklore, songs of loss in the way that, for example, the French Acadians brought down to Louisiana. Why don't we have that? Well, we don't have it partly because they got reintegrated into the British Empire. They remained British subjects from first to last. They found a new home. It was a new geographical home, but it wasn't necessarily a new identity as a settler, as a political subject, culturally speaking. And they were also reintegrated here into the U.S. somewhat, but I do think that we're missing something if we forget that this was a civil war. And I, like you, am fascinated by the discrepancy between the incredible sense we have about the need to rebuild after the Civil War of the 1860s and the way in which I think we've erased the needs to rebuild after the Revolution when our very values were in the process of being forged.
This event was part of the 2011 National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit loc.gov/bookfest.
The book came out of my attempt